Good evening and a happy new year to everyone. Welcome to our first virtual Heritage Group meeting of 2026. I'm Andrew Homer and I'll be chairing for tonight's presentation. Regulars will know that we take it in turns to chair these meetings. So tonight we have Chris Baker handling the technical side of things and our very own Ward Jones is presenting the talk. We welcome questions and comments, but please do put these in the chat as we go along, or wait until the end of the talk, of course. Now, just a usual couple of quick housekeeping points before we start. Please keep your microphones turned off. The talks themselves are recorded, and this one will be available shortly on the Black Country Society website and also our YouTube channel. Now, many of you regulars will know Ward Jones from our monthly meetings, but you probably won't know that Ward is a retired Methodist minister who, after studying in Cambridge, spent most of his active ministry in the west of England. Ward grew up in Gornal Wood, as did at least 5 generations of the Jones family line. Zoar was and remained his home church even after moving away from the village. He maintained a keen interest in the comings and goings and began putting together a record of its history back in 2014. Learning of plans for closure, he decided it was time to complete and publish his research. So, over to our own Ward Jones and Zoar Gornal Wood. Over to you, Ward.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Can everybody hear me okay? And are the pictures up okay?
Yes, looking fine, I think, Ward.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Fine, thank you. Okay, well, I want to take you to part of the Black Country which is too easily overlooked, and to a particular building in the village of Gornal Wood. You'll see there 3 pictures, one of a pub and 2 of chapel buildings. Their significance in this story will become clear as my presentation unfolds. So just in case you are among the uninformed and don't know where Gornal Wood is, I'm gritting my teeth and using a modern day map of the outline of the Black Country and the 4 authorities that claim to be part of it. And you'll see that Gornal Wood is on the edge. Leave Gornal Wood and it's still the case, you're out into the country, going out towards Himley, which has its own historical associations with the rest of the Black Country. So that's where we're going. And to appreciate the story of Zoar, you have to understand something of the background to Methodism in this part of the world. The story about Methodism coming to the Black Country begins in 1742 in Wednesbury, where we visit a place called the Hollow, which is a natural amphitheatre, and that's the Hollow. And alongside it, a farm building, Crabs Mill Farm. It was the home of a guy called John Sheldon. And the first Methodist gatherings in this part of the world were held in his farmhouse. It was 1742 when Charles Wesley, the brother of John Wesley, and they were the 2 guys who were the founding fathers, if you like, of the Methodist movement within the Christian church in this country. Charles, John's brother, visited there, and John himself came, I think it was the following year, to mission this part of the world. The story moves on when we've started the story to the fact that the Black Country, it's associated with Methodism, begins to grow and blossom and flourish. So it was that in 1744 the trail moved to Dudley. In Dudley, the Wesleys had a rough time of it, as they did in Wednesbury and in so many other places. They were attacked, they were interrupted during their meetings and in their preaching, whether it was in the open air or whether it was in a building. But so successful eventually was the missioning of Dudley that a fellowship was founded there, and eventually this amazing building, which I can only get part of in this particular slide, in King Street in Dudley. This chapel was built and it was opened in 1788. So some 40 odd years from when the Wesleys had first preached there. They'd advanced in that time, numbers had grown, and they could build such a splendid building as this. It was on what was probably John Wesley's last visit to King Street Chapel and to Dudley that the story for the first time links in to Gornal Wood. And there's an interesting background to that. A guy from Dudley who was part of the Methodist cause, a businessman, was passing through Gornal Wood and decided that he was going to have a haircut. As was so often the case in those days, a guy called Tom, who was a miner, also was a part-time barber. Tom cut the hair of this particular gentleman, who started chatting to him and telling him about this great preacher who was coming to Dudley, and you ought to come and hear him. Well, this was a rough-cut diamond of a miner, and he pooh-poohed the idea to begin with. And then he went away and reflected on what this guy had told him, talked to some of his friends, and they decided they would go and listen to John Wesley preaching. That was the start of the foundation of Methodism in Gornal Wood, because these guys decided when they got back that they would start to meet for fellowship. To invite preachers to come out from Dudley and share with them. You'll see this orange mark here on the map, and that was Furnace Row. Furnace Row to the south of the village. Here's the heart of the village. Here's where Zoar Chapel eventually would appear. This is the main road between Dudley and Himley, and there's the future location of another chapel which will be important for us to see in a moment or two. And anybody who knows this part of the world, this is Cinder Road going off down towards Wall Heath. So this was the main turnpike route following on through the village. So a house in Furnace Row becomes the base for the initial meetings in Gornal Wood. Tom and his friends would meet regularly, and interestingly, Furnace Row, so called because there'd been a furnace nearby. And there's another story to tell on another occasion. Near the site where Dudley conducted his experiments, and where he looked after his father's smelting works, and where in 1620 he claimed to smelt iron using coal instead of charcoal. Now, if you read the right history books and agree with what some of them say, the suggestion was that Dudley was called back by his father from Oxford and asked to look after the furnaces that were already there. As an authority on iron and steel industry, a guy called Schubert insists actually that the first Black Country furnace was erected in Gornal Wood. So a long association. That's just really something as an aside to the main story. But that's where they were, meeting in Furnace Row. Now, how did they get on, or how did the Methodists get on? Well, at this time, the village had something of a reputation. Let me read this to you. A few cottages dotted here and there, men as wild as untamed colts, without any education in the majority of cases, only a few who were able to read or write. The one object in life is to get money, either by working in a coal mine or a forge or brutal sports. No church or chapel, school or meeting house where selfishness and greed was rampant. Their one aim to get money and spend it in drunkenness and brutality. So the Methodist cause was going to have a pretty big struggle in engaging with these people and having a positive impact upon them. Well, what happens next? From those small beginnings and the meetings in Furnace Row, Methodism starts to take root. Just to note that the building on the left is one of the Methodist churches that's there in the village now. But on the right-hand side of this passage were some cottages where one of the group, not Tom, but one of the others in the group, lived, and they started to move there. And in fact, they moved around one or two different cottages to begin with. Successful missioning in the village and the surrounding area meant that they began to think about building a chapel for themselves. Now, the first chapel was built on land given to them by the Earl of Dudley. This was alongside the main thoroughfare between Dudley and Himley, and the site was the site where you see this church building now on the left. So having met in cottages, they were able to rent a building not far away from 1810, and then they started, having had that building and been successful in that building, to build the chapel. It was actually opened in 1827. It would have opened, or it would have been built and opened somewhat sooner than that, had it not been for the fact that most of the members were involved in the mining community, and that was a time when there was a big strike going on in the mines in that part of the world. Ironic, really, that the strikers were employed by the Earl of Dudley, who'd given the land to them, but they couldn't do anything about it because they just didn't have the money or the resources, although they did start to do some of the foundation work while they were laid off because of the strike. So 1827, and they opened the building. This is a page from their first finance records. One or two things to highlight here. 13 shillings spent on a new cupboard for the boys' school, because it was quite common in churches to have a resource to provide education for boys and girls. And clearly they started in that way alongside the missionary work, mainly to help boys or girls to read and write. Usually it was no more than reading the Bible and copying out passages from the Bible, but it was a good piece of work, and presumably they stored Bibles and the like in the cupboard in the boys' school. And then the second arrow down the page, candles were some of the things they bought, because that was how they lit the building, with candles. And then the third arrow, wine for refreshment for preachers. You wouldn't want to drink water in those days, of course. That was the good excuse. And as some people will know, Methodism eventually became teetotal, although that was the theory anyway. So they're established. They've got a building. We have no pictures or resources to show us anything of what that building was like. No information about what the interior was like. But there we are. They got the financial records, and I was just thankful that among the things that I discovered was the not a complete set of finance accounts, but quite a few with one or two gaps. Well, this all looked so good. It all looked so good. But the peace was soon to be disturbed. There were problems in Methodism nationally. The first 20 or 30 years of the 19th century, there were lots of disputes and divisions. And one of those disputes and divisions came home to Gornal Wood. There had been a big dispute on this occasion about the authority of the National Conference, which governed the church. And some people felt that the conference should have the final say on everything. In some places, the congregations felt that they should control themselves quasi-independently from the central authorities. Well, this was not good in Gornal, and some of the members of the church were thrown out because they were some of the rebels who wanted a bigger say for lay folk. So the superintendent minister, the senior minister, threw them out. What would they do? Well, they found themselves homeless. And that's where the story of that first picture you saw comes in. The Woodman Inn on the high street in Gornal Wood, and the wife of the innkeeper had significant associations with the Methodist Fellowship, and it was agreed that they could use a meeting room on the premises. And if you look at that picture there and look at the small extension on the side, it was in that part of the building that they began their meetings. All thanks to Mr. and Mrs. William Hughes, with Mrs. Hughes being the link between the congregation and the pub itself. Well, interesting place to start meeting for worship. For whatever reason, I don't know, I think it possibly was space. They moved further out of the village towards the Straits, if you know that part of the world, and they are on the pub trail again, because they now start to meet in this particular pub, the name of which has gone from me. What I can say is that it had an outhouse, and that's a modern picture of the outhouse with its steps going up to it. I'm just wanting to try and get rid of the bar that's on the bottom of the Fiddler's Arms, of course. Interestingly, back in the 1950s, when I was growing up in the village, I became a Cub Scout. And this is where we used to have our meetings, in this particular building, which I have to say was in a slightly better state than it was in a few years ago when I took a picture of it. But here they settle the exiles. This is their second home. Now, remember that account book? Well, interestingly, the account book becomes a possession of the exiles. And what I think must have happened is that whoever was treasurer in the original church on the Himley Road was also the treasurer of that church, and was one of the complainers who left the church or were thrown out of the church, and decided simply to take the account book with him. That's because all the subsequent entries after 1830 odd were those appertaining to the meeting of the exiles. Naughty man, naughty man. So they've gone and they've taken the finance records with them, and who knows what else. And they're on a bit of a hike around the village to meet in different places. So things move on for the exiles. And first of all, we're going to learn about the first buildings that they had for their chapels, known affectionately as the wooden and the brick tabernacles. And the pub crawl continues. Well, on this occasion, not to, but opposite the Limerick Inn. Records show us that they took possession of, so it seems, of premises opposite the Limerick Inn. The account book has an entry for December the 25th of all days in 1836, which records a collection of £9.19 and sixpence at the opening of the tabernacle. Now, December 1836, the opening of the tabernacle. The opening of the tabernacle. 1836, the opening of the tabernacle. Now, December 1836, the opening of the tabernacle. 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 1836, the ope This building at the end of 1836 presents an interesting conundrum. Some of you will know the name of Andrew Barnett, who in his day was an amazing historian in terms of Sedgley and the surrounding villages, former headmaster of Zoar of Redhall School, where I was trained in my early years. He, in some of his notes, talks about a small chapel erected in Summit Place near the site of the present Limerick Inn and registered by the William Horner in 1805. Now, what's that got to do with it all? Well, my theory is that that building fell into disrepute and into disuse, and its availability would help to explain the claim of one writer that in the winter season, preachers and hearers had to shelter under umbrellas during service. I'm sure that was the wooden tabernacle, because 1 year later, 1837, we begin to discover something about a new brick structure, the expenditure of which, let me hold that for a moment, the expenditure while they were in the wooden tabernacle included candles for lighting again, candlesticks because they'd need them to put the candles in, collecting boxes, and we read of various payments relating to timber work. So it all suggests that they're adapting this building, but it's going to be a temporary home. They're not going to do too much to it. And we move on within a year to what's known as the brick tabernacle. Noted in the National Methodist Records in 1838 was this entry: the Methodist New Connection Chapel between the Cockpit and Himley Road, same location opposite the Limerick Inn, Gornal Wood, opened 10th of December 1837. Amazing. Within a year they'd built or had built this brick tabernacle. The plans for that building cost £7 and 2 shillings. Legal expenses were £35. The site was purchased for £54. And when they had their opening on the 10th of December, the collections amounted to £32.16 and a penny. And then that picture on the right-hand side is the document that was recorded to show their legal ownership. Here are 4 of the first trustees. Titus Fellows was an interesting character, more of which anon, but note that name, Titus Fellows. So, brief stay in the wooden tabernacle, bits and pieces of work to keep it in a reasonable state, despite the rain coming in through the roof. And then within a year, they've got a more substantial home. And it's this period into the 1840s that proved to be a time of really effective missioning by the Methodists. The most memorable event was deemed to be a gracious revival under the ministry of the Reverend William Burroughs, when the membership sprang up in a short time from about 40 to over 200. Now, what's that document on the right-hand side? It's what's known, and some of you will know this, as a Methodist preaching plan. And I've included it here because there's an entry marked out for Gornal Wood. I've included it here because it shows where there were Methodist meetings in the locality by 1842. And that just is there to illustrate the rapid growth and development of the Methodist cause. Dudley, Tipton, Albury, Hilltop, Dudley, Port, Derby Hand, Five Ways, Netherton, Gornal Wood, Woodside, Pensnett, Rowley Regis, Cateshill, Old Hill, Tividale, Lower Gornal, New Walbrook, Sedgley, Whiteheath Gate, Wednesbury and West Bromwich. Powerful times. And then there's a bold move. In 1847, Lord Dudley decided to sell off several of his land holdings in the village. And the first option was always given to sitting leaseholders. And here we have a document relating to a particular piece of land at the heart of the village. The owners of this particular property were asked if they would like to take up the option, and they said no. And there are the inked-in responses to the questions. But note at the bottom there, circled, the name of that fellow I mentioned a moment or two ago, Titus Fellows. And what would seem the case is that Titus Fellows had approached the Dudley estate to say he was interested in buying that property. Well, where's this taking us in terms of the Methodist cause? Well, the point is, it was quite common in the middle of the 18th century, as Methodism expanded significantly across the Black Country, that some members of the Church of England were not too keen on allowing this expansion work taking place. And if they got wind of plans for a new building, life could become difficult for the local Methodists. So it became a practice, an occasional practice. It happened in Wolverhampton and it happened in Gornal, where one individual would buy the land so that there were no ripples in the community about anybody other than an individual taking an interest in this property. And so it was that Titus Fellows, who was a corn dealer, bought the property on behalf of the Methodists. And then the following year, he sold it to the trustees, who were then able to build not a church, but a Sunday school. That's why I've circled this building here. Ignore the church building, ignore the cottage alongside, although that will become the caretaker's cottage eventually. But this was the first property that they built. In 1850, they opened a Sunday school at what was and is the heart of the village. The main shops going down here, and opposite the schoolroom as was built there, the bus station later on here. So we're right at the heart of the village, and this was a powerful move by those people who had set out on the exiles train. Here's that same building, the left-hand side of it, that's the schoolroom, because no sooner had they built the Sunday school than they thought, well, what about a chapel at the heart of the of the village? And this was the result. It would be opened in 1854, 4 years after the school was opened. And it was a powerful presence in the middle of the village. This was what the interior looked like, or the pulpit area and the organ loft. And I suspect here that was where the singers, as they were before they started to be called choir, where the singers would sit and lead the worship. Grand pulpit, and this is the only picture of the inside of that Zoar, and it is the first Zoar, more of which anon, that was there in the middle of the village. The chapel is 40 feet long, 36 feet wide and 28 feet high from the floor to the ceiling. It had a gallery on 3 sides, and it was supposed to hold 450 people. Zoar, a very apposite name. It's mentioned in the book of Genesis. The kingdom of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zebulun, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and they joined the battle in the valley of Siddim. It's just the mention of Zoar there. But the fact was that when the battle took place, Zoar was to be the only one of the so-called cities of the plain to escape subsequent destruction. It became known as a place of refuge. Lot would hide near here. Isaiah's oracle concerning Moab, it's the place to which the refugees flee. Well, this is the place to which those exiles flee. And so the name of Zoar, carefully chosen. What was going on in the life of the chapel? Well, Sundays and weekdays in terms of worship, divine service 10:30 and 6 o'clock, school 9:30 and 2 o'clock. In the weekdays, public prayer meetings, class meetings, and the two activities that possibly you haven't come across before, what was known as the adult school, in brackets male, held at 7:30 on a Sunday morning, and the Thursday evening, the pleasant evening at 7 o'clock. Well, these were significant activities which were quite common in the second half of the 19th century across various churches and chapels. The adult school male. It was a supplement to the Sunday school activities for boys and girls. It was for young men to attend, and the intention was to help educate them. Held on a Sunday at 7:30 a.m. because that was one of the few times when they were free to actually meet together. And this was a resource that was the making of many young men who otherwise would have made very little progress in life. The adult schools reached their peak by the time of the First World War, which, to put it another way, was really marked the demise of those activities. And then the Thursday pleasant evening was more of an attempt to engage with people who didn't necessarily come to Sunday worship. It was an idea that began in Birmingham, led by a congregational minister, and he had the bright idea, if you could have a fairly relaxed gathering, you can engage with people who didn't have too much connection with the church and maybe draw them into the fellowship. The symbol of the pleasant Sunday afternoon, it was the movement, but here in Gornal it took place on a Thursday evening. The symbol of the movement was two hands shaking, one hand giving and one hand receiving a friendly welcome. The pleasant evening. Music in worship. Music in worship illustrates the way in which things moved on through time. In the 1850s, singing at services continued to be led by a group of singers. After 1869, they were recorded as the choir rather than singers. In 1857, they purchased a harmonium, and in 1861, a trumpet. Not many churches had trumpets, I don't think, but they did at Zoar. By the 1880s, their repertoire was expanding to include the singing of anthems and special music for harvest festivals, Christmas, and the Wake Tea entertainment. And the Wake Tea was a big event, not just for fundraising, but also for fellowship on an annual basis. The earliest musical accompaniment, apart from the singers, was from the earliest days, was provided by a bass viol. And then a more traditional style of musical production, an organ purchased in 1883. With it came the need for not only an organist, but also an organ blower, both of whom would be paid for their services. Well, you can understand the organist. One of my first jobs in the life of not the church but the Sunday school, where we had an old church organ which had been moved in and had a blower, was to stand behind the organ and pump heartily and make sure that the lead weight, which indicated there was enough air in, would just get near to the line where it wasn't sufficiently pumped up, and then we'd go like the bellows to pump it back up again. One of the things about the church was that it was influential in the local community, as so many other churches were. And some examples of that. In the 1890s, as education was being more organised and expanded to more and more youngsters, there was a dearth of suitable premises. And even when the Red Hall schools up the road were built, there still wasn't enough accommodation in the early days. And so the Urban District Council rented the schoolroom for education. Lots of lettings, some interesting descriptions. A women's club was recorded in the financial accounts. A death club, which I think was probably a friendly society. The miners' union were allowed to meet there, although sometimes if it was thought that they were going to be a bit rumbustious, the booking wasn't taken. And a friendly society committed to the temperance movement, which would have appealed to those Methodists, the Rechabites. The Free Gardeners' Lodge, which was another friendly society. The splendidly named Lower Gornal Protestant Churchmen's Mission. And there were regular bookings from the Liberal Association. And very interestingly, one of the regular lettings was to the local doctor. Quite a few activities relating to medical care were eventually taking place in the church school. It began in 1872 with Dr. Walker and the premises being used for a vaccination clinic. And the timing of the commencement of that letting suggests it was a consequence of the government's 1871 Vaccination Act, which was an attempt to enforce previous legislation following a bad smallpox epidemic. The balance sheet at the end of the 19th century is a good example of the expanding activities and costs involved. Money on music, paying for various bits and pieces linked to the music, the tuning of the organ, the grant to the choir, buying music, the supply of gas, more of which in a while, children's treats, the chapel, as with many other chapels, made a great play of its work with children. And then there were lots of incidentals, the fire insurance, bill posting, lots of incidentals, and money that they had to pay to the church nationally. One interesting experience in the life of the church, when they applied for permission to be authorised to register weddings, which independent free churches were allowed to do towards the end of the 19th century. They applied for permission to do that, and they discovered when they applied for permission to begin to register weddings that when the chapel had been opened in the 1850s, nobody had remembered to seek permission for public worship to take place in the chapel. So they had to start from scratch again. So this was the certificate they obtained for the authorization to hold religious worship. It was only nearly 50 years late, and then they were able to register to celebrate marriages as well. What next? 1904, 50 not out. This particular poster marked the great reunion tea meeting. It was a gathering together to celebrate the 50 years that the chapel had been opened. There was a great reunion tea meeting, and there were lots of other activities which would take place. Question was, what shall we do with the building? Or what shall we do to the building? These were the three guys who were invited to come and preach to mark the 50th anniversary. Reverends Ryder, Bartram and Jewell, all of whom were leading members of the Methodist Church. The Grand Bazaar, all about proceeds for reconstruction scheme. It was a grand bazaar, to say the least, held on 2 days in April 1905, supported by a distinguished collection of people, 2 MPs, local JP, leading industrialists, a long list of councillors and significant people in the local community. The objects of the bazaar told us that they wanted £1,800, which was going to be the cost of the renovations that were being thought about. Each day followed the same pattern. There would be an opening ceremony with a short act of worship, lots of speeches by significant people, and then the comings and goings of the event. Musical activities, yes, the Pierrots were entertaining. There were concerts in the large classroom. Fascinating event, the washing competition for men. And anybody could enter on the day. I'd love to know what the results were, but I don't have any source of information on that one. Now, this is the second Zoar. The building is still there today. This was the building that would be closed down for Methodist worship a couple of years ago. It opened in 1906. But you said they were talking about renovations of that earlier building. Yeah, well, they were, and that was the intention. The bazaar, with all its activities, raised over £200, and that 1,800 that they wanted to raise by mid-1905, they had 1,100. So they got in touch with the national authorities and said, we want to renovate. The national authorities came back to them and said, your work is so impressive and your activities are so effective that you ought to think about replacing your church building with a more substantial one. And we'll give you £250 towards that if you'll do it. Well, the foundation stones were laid in May 1906, and this building was opened in November 1906. And note, if you will, that space there. And see what it's replaced by. It was always the intention to have a clock in the church building to keep the middle of the village in the knowledge of what the time was. And most of the time it was actually working. Well, they decided that they would have a clock, and they would put in the clock as a memorial to those members of the church who had been killed in the First World War. You'll see there a black blob, which is actually an inserted stone which records the names of those who were killed. And this was the company who installed the clock for the trustees. It cost £158, and gas, because it was operated by gas, was laid on by the Sedgley Gasworks at a cost of £4.12 and 4pence, and the gasworks was actually in the village, the gas had been connected as early as 1865. It was used initially for lighting the chapel. Using gas for lighting was something that not everybody was happy with at the time. People were frightened about the flames, not surprisingly. But apparently it was decided by Parliament that they would have gas lighting in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and that proved an impetus to people around the country going with the same thing and having the gas. So in 1865 they put the gas in, and the gas board supplied the gas to keep the clock going. And then in 1926 they installed electricity for the first time, and this was the response to their request for the electricity to be installed. During the Second World War, they had to apply to the trustees for permission to get coal to keep the place heated when they were meeting. I don't know who filled this form in. Blimey, what a mess it makes. And also, they were one of the places where they had influence where it mattered to keep their metal railings outside the building, which, as a young lad, I spent summer holidays repainting those railings with a friend of mine. In 1935, they decided to celebrate the centenary of that breakaway movement when the exiles first met together, having been thrown out of the first Methodist Church on the Himley Road. This very bland document, it compares unfavourably with that one that was celebrated in 1905. And to me, it's always been symbolic of the fact that things were starting to decline. The ministers who looked after Zoar were always based in Dudley until in 1936 it was decided to rent a manse in Gornal Wood, and this guy, Dean Sheriff, was the first minister to be based in the village. And they made a big do of that as well. Here's one of those posters which they used for Sunday school anniversaries to promote them, and harvest festivals, and you'd stick these up in your front window, and they were as big as it suggests they look like here. And blimey, all that list of speakers. One of many special concerts. On this occasion, it was to help fund the purchase of that manse. Isabel Bailey, who seems to crop up in so many different parts of the country in churches, came on at least 2 occasions to Zoar and gave a concert. A united choir sang, and the organist was a guy called William Timmins, who would be with the church for another 20 or more years. But Isabel Bailey came as a wonderful soloist. One of the fascinating things about churches is the ways in which they raised money. Pew rents. If you've ever been in a church and seen little metal fixtures to the backs of pews, that was where you put your rent card in. If you rented a pew, you paid so much every quarter, and that was your pew, and lo and behold, anybody else who dared to sit in it. At the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, things had been so difficult with fundraising through the pew rents that the Zoar trustees decided to appoint a rent collector, and he was paid a percentage of whatever money he managed to collect. Things were so well organised that they bought this splendid ledger, and in it they wrote the numbers of the pews, the number of sittings in the pew that somebody rented, and interestingly, there Miss Mary Nichols was my grandmother. Mrs. James Passmore was her mother, and Mr. James Wakelam was Mrs. James Wakelam was her sister. Two sisters who were the only children to survive from a family of 12 children into adulthood. That was. There are a few pages of the seat rent ledger filled with names and entries, but whoever was doing it must have obviously got fed up because there's more space in there than there is used pages. One of the things that was quite common, especially in the 20s, 30s, 40s, was a hospital Sunday, when churches would collect and give money to the Royal Hospital, particularly in those days when there was no National Health Service. And depending on how much was subscribed, they came back to the local church chits, which could be given to patients who could then ask for outpatient or inpatient treatment without having to pay for it. So it was a community service as well as a support from the hospital. And Zoar had those regular collections. In this case, the money went to the Royal Hospital in Wolverhampton. There were also appeals for the Dudley Guest Hospital. Civic Sunday symbolises that link between churches, particularly in the 19th and first half of the 20th century. The civic service held in the church when the Urban District Council chairman would attend with various other local officials. And then to symbolise the way in which gradually through the 20th century things began to drop away. Figures here: 1928, 689 youngsters on the church registers. 600 attendances at the two gatherings. 1942, it's dropping down. 1975, well, there were still 156, but that's really where things are really starting to tail off. Some people may remember one of the features of being a member of the Sunday school was that you got prizes for attendance. And those who attended on a Sunday morning, if they were in church, when they went out after the notices, they would be given one of these stickers, which they would stick into an album, hand them in at the end of the year, and then get a first, second or third prize, depending on how often they had attended. The Sunday school anniversaries, big occasions, packed out, preachers coming from elsewhere. 3 services, morning, afternoon and evening, repeated a fortnight later. Massive congregations. Typical example from the 1950s of the church at Zoar and the choristers. And this more fairly traditional approach lasted through into the 1970s. I'm going to skip through the rest because time is going on. One of the annual outreach activities was a procession of witness, where the 4 Methodist churches in Lower Gornal and Gornal would gather together and march around the village, stopping 4 or 5 times, singing a hymn. Somebody would say a few words and then they'd march on. Another picture of the gradual decline. Membership statistics for the years that I managed to find records for, and this gap here, but this is the time when we are seeing the peak of activity, and it starts to fade away gradually. Significant attempts to keep up with the times. This was a holiday club back in the not so long ago, maybe 10 years ago, possibly not even that. But the work seemed to decline and decline significantly as time unfolded. So much so that by the end of 2023, it was decided, after some disruption in the small congregation caused by decisions being made in the National Conference, that some people left the church, and those who remained felt they could manage to keep going no longer. it was too much to maintain the building, and it was closed for Methodist worship. We held a celebration back in November 24, and I gave a talk based on what I've shared with you this evening, and published my researches in this book. And thankfully, although the Methodist work had finished, an independent evangelical church which had good relations with the trustees and which was rented a small area of the premises, said they'd like to rent the building, and they are now renting the building and having an amazing effect in terms of community work. In many ways, they've picked up the mantle of what was, and it's great, I think, that the building is being used because it's at the heart of the village, and its location is just amazing, to say the least. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that Zoar Methodist Church.